Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, and welcome back to the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast. This is episode number 2. So in episode number 1, I talked about what it looks like when kids struggle. And what I'd like to do is to now talk about the assessment process, because part of what I did when I talked about when kids struggle, why we should not overlook it, why we need to pay attention, I also spoke about the need and the importance of an intervention. And before you can get to intervention, you have to get an assessment. So I want to really demystify the assessment process in this episode. So again, the reason to do an assessment is when you are seeing a child struggle, when you are seeing a child not finishing homework, having trouble with getting classwork completed. For others, you may see kids who have been performing well, but then over time, their grades began to drop. And then parents and educators may be wondering what happened. And while it's not unusual for some kids to experience difficulties at school, if struggles are getting in the way of a child's social life, their academics, sports, or other activities, if difficulties are hindering their success, then it might be time to consider an evaluation, an assessment, so that you can find out what is getting in the way and determine the best course of action moving forward. Typically, that course of action might be a specific targeted intervention, but you need to first know what you need to target. So if a child is consistently facing the same issues, it's worth looking a little bit deeper to determine the reason and what needs to be done. And although early intervention and assessment is always best, it's never too late to evaluate a child when you see a child struggling and when you see a child might be in need of some support. So what an assessment does is it helps better understand a child's experience. It helps you get to the root of the difficulties. And after that process is complete, what you typically end up with is a roadmap that outlines how to help your child navigate difficulties. Now, sometimes children are struggling in school because of an undiagnosed neurodevelopmental disorder or a medical condition. And what you want to do is to rule out or rule in whether or not that is the case for your child. And what we want to know also is how to help that child overcome struggles. And for many neurodevelopmental disorders, once we identify it, those struggles can be overcome with appropriate intervention and support. So let's jump in and learn more about the assessment process, what that looks like. And again, I'm hoping to help people better understand what that process looks like. So when individuals are coming in for an assessment for their child, parents are typically bringing their kids in, and they often want to know, well, what does that process look like? And they've heard that there are a number of tests that are administered to their child, that are administered to kids. But really what is important to know is that the assessment is so much more than tests that are administered. So the testing is part of the assessment, but it's not the complete assessment. The assessment actually begins when you first communicate with the parents, when you're gathering information from them about what it is that they're observing. So an assessment will typically involve an interview with parents. So in our practice, that interview can be anywhere from an hour to 2 hours, depending on the history that we need to get from those parents and how much is involved, how much history there is. And the interview with parents gives us information about that child, and we get information from pregnancy, birth and delivery, early developmental milestones. We want to get family history, medical history. All of that information is important. And it's important because it helps us to identify whether or not a child has risk factors for a particular neurodevelopmental disorder. Some neurodevelopmental disorders are more common in kids with certain risk factors, like premature birth, extremely low birth weight, issues that occurred during birth and delivery, things like reduced oxygen or oxygen deprivation at birth can put kids at increased risk for neurodevelopmental issues or areas of difficulty. We also know that when there's a family history of neurodevelopmental struggles, those kids in those families have a greater likelihood of having those same neurodevelopmental struggles. And so all of that information is important. So we're going to be asking about, in the assessment process, we are going to be asking about, again, pregnancy. Was that a normal pregnancy? We're going to be asking about birth and delivery. We're going to be asking about those early developmental milestones. We want to know whether or not the language issues that you're observing now were observed early on. So we're going to be asking questions about when a child first spoke, said their first words, started to put words together to express thoughts and ideas. We're going to ask questions about when a child first demonstrated their ability to understand and follow instructions and directions. So we're going to be asking about all of that information because all of it is important. We're going to be asking about when a child began to walk, how toilet training went. We're going to be asking about sleep, and we're going to be asking about early feeding. All of that information together gives us information about a child's kind of developmental trajectory and helps us to identify, again, any risk factors in that child that would make them at increased risk for having struggles with learning or struggles with paying attention or struggles in their social relationships. We're also going to gather other information from other sources. A child spends a great deal of time in the classroom with a teacher if they're in a traditional classroom and not homeschooled. So we want to know what it is that those teachers are observing in the classroom. We want to know because we want to know if the struggles that parents are observing at home are similar to the struggles that a teacher might be observing in a school setting. We want to know from parents and teachers, when does the problem appear to be worse? And what helps the problem? What makes things better for that child? All of that is important information because it also helps us determine, how to support that child once we identify the source of the struggle. And so teachers are really important sources of information because they are observing that child in the classroom, on the playground, in solo activities, in group activities, and they're looking at a child's response to different modes of instruction. An assessment is also going to involve behavioral observations. So in some instances, we will be looking at a child in their classroom environment. So we're going to go to the school and we're going to observe the child in a classroom. We're going to observe transitions from one class to another. We're going to observe the child in classes where they struggle and in other environments where they are thriving and doing well. And we're also going to observe that child in the testing session. So I'm going to look at when a child is performing tests and completing tasks, how are they behaving? How are they interacting with me? And those behavioral observations begin when the child first enters the office. I'm going to be looking at things like how easily does the child separate from a parent, how engaging they are, what their eye contact looks like. I'm going to look at their attitude towards the testing. For some kids, they're really excited and they can't wait to show what it is that they know. For some kids, when they face struggles or difficulty on a particular task, they persevere and they work at it and they keep going and going and going, even if it takes them a long period of time. For other kids, as soon as they see that this is going to be more challenging, they give up. They say it's too hard. I don't know how. And so all of those observations are important. So behavioral observations of a child in the testing session, at school, in their school environment. And sometimes I have parents actually videotape their child at home, and I observe those videos as well. I'm also going to ask the child about their experience. So an assessment should involve including the child and asking the child about their experience at school, at home, what is easy for you, what is hard for you, what makes things better, what are some things that you are struggling with. We want to know from the child's perspective what that looks like. And so that's important. So it's not only about getting information from parents and teachers, we want to get information from the child as well. And then part of that information is not only in an informal interview, although you can also have structured interviews, we also give rating forms. An assessment will often include standardized rating forms or questionnaires that are given to parents and teachers where they evaluate a child and they endorse certain symptoms or behaviors or observations, and they rate that child in terms of whether or not they see that behavior, that symptom often, sometimes, never. And then all of that data is collected to help us determine whether or not a child is demonstrating more difficulties than you would typically see in a child that age, that grade level, or is a parent reporting things that you would typically see in a 6-year-old boy or in a 13-year-old girl. So all of that information is important. And then we also include the testing, right? The testing is when the child comes in for the assessment to complete tasks. And it's typically done in a one-on-one setting where the person who's doing the evaluation and doing the assessment gets to observe how the child completes the tasks. And so what I'm going to do is to talk about the different domains that are typically included in an assessment. It's important to keep in mind that the domains being evaluated will differ depending on the type of assessment being conducted. And we'll talk later on in subsequent episodes about the different types of assessments. But again, if you're doing kind of a comprehensive evaluation where a child is coming in and you don't know why they're struggling and you want to figure it out, typically you're assessing a number of different domains because you want to really get to the root of the problem and rule things out. One of the areas that is assessed is intellectual functioning or general cognitive abilities. And so that's kind of a big term for assessing a number of different abilities that fall under the umbrella of intellectual functioning, but it's typically asking kids to complete tasks that they've never been asked to complete before. So they're new, novel, unfamiliar tasks, and they have to draw on their experiences, on their ability to figure things out in the moment, to problem solve, to complete the task successfully. And there are verbal tasks of intellectual functioning, visual spatial tasks of intellectual functioning. There are tasks that are timed, those that are not timed. There are tasks that involve attention and working memory. And so by giving tasks of intellectual functioning or general cognitive abilities, you're getting a child's profile on a number of those different subdomains. So you're getting their performance in verbal versus nonverbal, attention and working memory and processing speed. And oftentimes that pattern of performance across those different areas that fall under the umbrella of intellectual functioning can give you some really good information about a child's functioning. It also is often used to determine whether or not there are global delays in a child. A child who might be struggling in school, one of the things we might want to know is this a specific learning disorder, or is this a global developmental delay that's impacting a number of different areas, including academic performance? And so a measure of general cognitive abilities and general cognitive testing will help us to figure that out. Another domain that needs to be assessed, that is typically assessed in an evaluation, is academic achievement, which is oftentimes the reason why kids are referred for an assessment or an evaluation. It's because we want to find out how a child is performing in reading, writing, and math. And we're going to look at those three areas in a number of different ways. So in the last episode, I said that kids can struggle with reading for a number of different reasons. So when you're doing an assessment, when assessment is performed, you're looking at phonological processing or phonics, a child's ability to sound out words. You're looking at their ability to read accurately, to read quickly, and you're looking at their ability to read and understand what it is that they've read. So we're looking at reading comprehension. For writing, we're going to look at spelling. We're going to look at writing at the sentence level and writing at the essay level or the narrative writing level. For math, we're going to look at the ability to complete math calculations and also the ability to solve math word problems. So math conceptualization. So again, and the reason for looking at these academic areas in a number of different ways is because we want to know where things break down, where things are breaking down for that child, so we know where exactly to intervene when we're developing an intervention plan. Another thing that we look at when we're assessing academic functioning is we want to know how children perform under timed and untimed conditions. And that's often important because for some kids, they don't have a difficult time understanding particular concepts. And I'll use math for an example. They don't have any difficulty with the concepts of math, but they just can't perform math calculations or math word problems quickly. And so that's important because the intervention or the accommodation for that child is going to be different than for a child who doesn't understand math concepts or doesn't have a good understanding of number sense or math facts. Another domain that's assessed is attention and concentration. And when we assess for attention and concentration, we're assessing for that because there are a number of processing issues that can interfere with learning, and attention is one of those. So we want to look at a child's ability and an adolescent's ability to pay attention for a short period of time and that person's ability to pay attention over an extended period of time. And that's important to look at both because some kids can pay attention for a short period of time, but they can't sustain their attention over an extended period of time. We're going to look at a child's ability to pay attention to things that he hears versus things that he sees, because those are different ways of taking in and focusing on information. And for some kids, it can be different in terms of the best way that they can pay attention and engage in a classroom setting. We're going to also look at, in an assessment, memory. We know that learning and memory is critical for kids in an academic setting because they have to remember information that's presented to them in the classroom so that the next day when the teacher picks up where she left off, they can draw on that information, pull that information out of their memory, connect it to new ideas that are now being explained in the classroom, and then it helps them to continue with the learning process. And so we want to know how learning and memory is developing, has developed. So we want to pay attention to a child's ability to encode information into their memory and then retrieve it when they need it. And then after there's been some distraction, after they've done other things, can they come back and still remember that information that was presented to them earlier? So we're going to look at memory, again, in a number of different ways. We're going to look at a child's memory for things that he sees versus things that he hears, because again, those are two different memory systems. And for some kids, those systems can develop differently, where a child may have a stronger visual memory than a verbal memory. So we want to, again, look at those things because that can inform intervention later on. And it can also explain why a child might be struggling in a classroom setting. Another process that we look at is executive functioning, and I'm going to talk about executive functioning in another episode, but it's really an umbrella term that describes a number of different things that include organization, planning, and an individual's ability to achieve and work towards accomplishing a goal. And so that is important because that's typically what kids are asked to do, what adolescents are asked to do in a classroom setting. And there might be increased demands for executive functioning as kids get older or in different academic settings, depending on what that setting looks like. So we're going to look at executive functioning and assess for that. In an assessment, language functioning is also evaluated. And typically what is assessed is expressive language, a child's ability to express his thoughts and ideas. Do his thoughts and ideas come out of his mouth the way that he intended? We're also going to look at knowledge of vocabulary words, what words mean, similarities between words, And then we're going to look at receptive language, a child's ability to understand information that is presented to him. And sometimes kids who have receptive language issues may struggle with following directions or instructions. So that's important to evaluate for receptive language issues if they're there, because again, the intervention for a child who's struggling with language-based issues is going to be different than a child who's struggling with an attention-based issue. The other thing we're going to look at is visual, spatial, and visual motor functioning. And those domains are important because they really help us better understand how a child perceives information that he sees. And often that's important when kids are copying information from the board. We also want to look at motor coordination, fine motor skill, because that can impact a child's ability to hold a pencil, to write, to copy information. So it becomes important as well, particularly if kids have to copy information and write quickly and accurately. Sometimes kids are struggling with writing because of a developmental coordination issue that's based in fine motor skills or difficulties with fine motor skills. And so we want to be able to identify that so then we can get, again, the appropriate intervention. And I keep saying that because it's so important to know, to tie the assessment to the intervention, because that's the whole reason why we're doing it, right? We're doing it so we can better understand and then determine what it is that we need to do. And so the other thing we need to keep in mind is that children and adolescents are social beings. So even if they're struggling with learning and they're struggling in school, they're often having an emotional response to the struggle. And we want to be able to check in with them and to evaluate that. So we want to look at their self-concept. What are they saying about themselves? How do they feel about themselves and their experience? We also want to check for anxiety, check for depression, for sadness, because those things can be the reason kids are struggling. So kids who are depressed can have difficulties with attention, with motivation that are rooted in a depressive episode and not necessarily an attention issue. And the same could be true for anxiety, where kids might be struggling with anxiety because it might be that they are fearful of making mistakes. And this might be a child who is asked to write an essay and they have a blank sheet of paper in front of them. And they have great expressive language. They have a good ability to pay attention. They've got all the thoughts and ideas in terms of what they want to write. There's nothing wrong with their fine motor abilities, so they can write once they get that paper on the pencil. But they are so fearful of saying the wrong thing, of not saying it correctly, of it not being perfect, that they sit and they stare at the blank page and they don't write anything. Or they may even run to the restroom and avoid the task altogether. So you want to be able to identify whether or not the learning difficulty or the struggles in school or with homework are tied to an anxiety issue or even an anxiety disorder. So we want to assess for those things as part of the evaluation. We're also going to look at, and this really speaks to kind of the questionnaires and the interview with parents and teachers, we're going to ask about somatic complaints. And these are things like stomach aches and headaches. We want to know how often they occur, when do they occur. We're going to look for a pattern. So a child who doesn't typically complain about headaches and stomach aches until Sunday evening or the Monday morning of a new school week, then we're going to kind of look at that, particularly if a child is also experiencing some symptoms of or showing some symptoms of anxiety. So again, we're going to take in all of this information. We're also going to look at acting out behaviors. We're going to look at frustration tolerance, rule-breaking behaviors, defiant behaviors, because sometimes they can coexist with a learning issue. And sometimes kids can be exhibiting these behaviors to cover up for a learning struggle. So they're acting out because they're having these struggles. And we want to be able to provide support in that area as well. And so again, we're going to be looking at a number of different things when you're thinking about an assessment. We're again assessing for the reason for the struggle so that we can then determine what is needed for that child to be successful. And so again, we think about those domains of cognitive functioning. We're thinking about their social and emotional experience. We're gathering information from parents and teachers. And in those in that communication with parents, what you're going to gather is information also about media exposure. And we're kind of in the early stages of understanding how media use affects cognitive functioning, affects learning, affects mental health. But there is some research to suggest that it does impact sleep. And we also know that sleep is critical for mental health and learning. And so in an assessment, parents will often be asked questions about a child's media use. And some research has come out that shows that adolescents who spend more time on media screens are more likely to report depression and suicidal thoughts and behaviors. There's some research to show that, significant media exposure or media use can have a negative impact on attention and the ability to focus and engage in executive functions. And so we want to gather that information to see, again, if there's a pattern there. And it's really important, particularly with respect to the extent to which media exposure impacts sleep, because sleep and sleep deprivation specifically can mimic issues with attention that impact learning. And so we're going to be asking questions as part of the assessment about sleep, about how much sleep a child is getting. Are they staying asleep? Is it easy for them to fall asleep? We're going to be asking questions and observing them in the classroom and looking at sleepiness, about fatigue. All of those things will help us better understand because, again, if media exposure and sleep deprivation are the causes of the attention issues, of the learning issues, then that is an easy fix. That is an easy fix. You limit the media exposure and you make sure that they have adequate sleep and they have good sleep habits. And so again, we want to gather this information because we want to figure out what it is we need to do, again, to support a child moving forward. We also want to look at exercise. Exercise is pretty important because we know that exercise is connected to positive physical outcomes, but it also has mental health benefits. And so, for example, if you're doing an assessment and a parent is reporting difficulties with or is reporting depression or anxiety, or parents are concerned about depression or anxiety, we want to know the extent to which a child is getting exercise because we can know that exercise can enhance mental health. It can improve mood. And then also there's some research to show that it stimulates brain growth and boosts cognitive performance. So we are also looking at that as another way of supporting a child and their better functioning at school and at home. So again, when we're doing an assessment, the goal is to identify the reason why a child is struggling. We're going to also, in that process of an assessment, identify the strengths. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to identify the child's strengths and not just their weaknesses, because you want to have a strength-based approach to intervention. You want that child to know what his or her strengths are and be able to use those strengths to compensate for areas of weakness. We want to know when we do the assessment, when we gather all of that information, we analyze all the information, if there is a neurodevelopmental disorder, if there is a specific learning disorder in reading, in writing, in math, if there's an attention disorder, because that will tell us, again, the type of intervention that is needed to help that child better access the curriculum and be more successful at school, at home, on the playground, on the soccer field. So all of that information that we gather during the assessment will help us to, again, understand a child's profile, to understand their struggles, and helps parents and educators have patience and insight and know how to help that child. And again, we also want to know if there is a learning disorder. And it is important. It's not the sole reason why we're doing an assessment, but if you're doing an assessment, it's one of the things that you will typically determine or rule out. Is there a learning disorder? And we're going to do some episodes about different types of learning disorders, what they look like, what are some specific recommendations and interventions that target those particular learning disorders. But what we do know about learning disorders is that when a child has a learning disorder, what that means is that they have academic skills that are substantially below what you would expect for a child his or her age. And not only are they experiencing difficulties, those difficulties are interfering with their ability to perform academically and may even be interfering with their activities of daily living. And again, that's typically confirmed through an assessment process, and then we can make recommendations moving forward. So again, some key takeaways is that an assessment is important if a child is suspected of having a learning or a processing issue that's impacting their ability to function at home, at school, again, on the playground, with peers. And the other thing to keep in mind is that an assessment is only the first step. It's the first step in determining the reason for the struggle. But once we have that information, we can then implement effective treatment programs, interventions, strategies, accommodations at school, modifications at school, and we can put things in place that take into consideration a child's strengths and helps that child, again, use those strengths to compensate for areas of difficulty. So what an assessment does is it helps to better understand why a child is struggling. It helps to get to the root of the difficulties, helps you to understand a child's experience. And then you get a roadmap that outlines not only why the child is struggling, but how to help that child navigate difficulties and how to help that child overcome their struggles so that they can thrive. I hope that you found the information I shared in this episode helpful. I feel very strongly that if we put in place certain practices, more children with undetected learning disabilities would be identified early and receive appropriate treatment, including preventative treatment. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to educate pediatricians, teachers, and parents about the different learning challenges that students face and how to address them. But that's why I started this podcast. So stay tuned. We will continue the conversation about assessment next week with my guest, pediatric neuropsychologist, Dr. Vindhya Fernandez. See you next week.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.